Hello and welcome back to the Center for Political and Cultural Theory. My name is Dr. Roger Green. This is an ongoing contextualized reading of Jacques Derrida's essay, Force of Law. I'm going to pull it up here again for us and share my screen. We are into part two of this very dense essay. And this, if we remember from earlier contextualized readings, this is put together over two talks, right? Like so, and then compiled into one essay in this volume uh, on a deconstruction, the possibility of justice. So when we get to part two here, this is where we're going to get to Jacques Derrida reading uh, Walter Benjamin's Critique of Violence, which is a famous essay by Benjamin. That essay is not one that we've read as the intro for this course, but it might be something that as you're working through these, you might actually look at Benjamin's essay. What I am more interested in at this point, because this is an intro class, is walking through Derrida's thinking, right? So we are looking at Derrida's interpretation of Walter Benjamin in the context of this idea of force of law. So it becomes a kind of case point for him. And I think that I could easily do a contextualized reading just on Benjamin's essay because it's really widely read to begin with. But just for focus here, and because we're walking through here, I just want to remind the viewer slash listener that what we're dealing with is Derrida's mind. And this is, of course, probably an introduction to Derrida, who's got all sorts of jargon and terminology and ways of thinking that are particular to his own style of thought. What the point is in an intro to critical theory course is really just thinking about like what it is that like how people do this thing called critical theory, and that's what I'm more interested in. I mean, of course, the concepts are super interesting about law and force and the way it taps into many other themes that we've been dealing with going back all the way to Carl Schmitt, who's going to show up in this particular essay as well. Okay, so that intro aside, uh, let's look here. Part two of the essay um, uh, jumps into the critique of violence, and he says Benjamin's analysis reflects the crisis in the European model of bourgeois liberal parliamentary democracy, and so the crisis and the concept of droit, law or right in French, right, that is inseparable from it. Germany in its defeat is at this time a place in which the crisis is extremely sharp, a crisis whose originality also comes from certain modern features like the right to strike, the concept of the strike in general, with or without reference to Sorel. So what Derrida is saying is that when we're looking at Benjamin's piece, we have to remember that he's writing his critique of violence in the aftermath of World War I, in the failed state or failing liberal democracy of the Germany of the 1920s, and that ultimately leads into the rise of the Third Reich and the Nazis in 1933. And so placing Benjamin historically is going to be important. And of course, that's part of what doing critical theory is. It's like we're looking at the historical moment. We're also looking at our own moment, right? And so just as a reminder, this is about 1989 when Derrida is writing this and thinking about the past century, but also thinking about that the Berlin Wall has come down. What's coming with the 1990s? It seems like the crumbling of the Soviet Union, although we're not completely there. We're not completely to the early 1990s yet, but these things are part of the process. And then another thing, just for contemporary folks that might be uh, uh, especially United States students, there is no European Union yet, right? In when Derrida is writing this essay. And so there are a whole bunch of works that we could look at, Blanchot or Jean-Luc Nancy, like the inoperative community, and partly what they're dealing with there is, and the interest in international law and concepts is the idea of a kind of unified Europe. Um, so keeping that in mind. So we go on here. It's not highlighted here, but he says it's also the aftermath of war and the pre-war that saw the European development and the failure of pacifist discourse. That's going to be important as a theme as we go on here. Anti-militarism, the critique of violence, including juridico-political or police violence, which will soon be repeated in the years to follow. It is also the moment in which questions of the death penalty and the right to punish in general are painfully current. Change in the structures of public opinion, thanks to the appearance of new media powers such as radio, begins to put into question this liberal model of parliamentary discussion or deliberation in the production of laws and so forth. And so that's like a really interesting when we're looking about that back to the between the wars, right? That moment in history, there is this expansion in media. There's expansion in radio. And with that, just as there is today, when we think about AI or we think about deep fakes on the internet, the way that that is disrupting our current sense of democracy, producing crises in democracy. Well, Derrida has already located this back in earlier in the 20th century. And so he goes on to say, such conditions motivated the thoughts of German jurists like Carl Schmitt, to mention only him. And so I was also interested in by several historical indices. For example, this text, at once mystical in its overdetermined sense that interests us here, and hypercritical, this text, which in certain respects can be read as neo-messianical Jewish mysticism grafted onto post-Sorelian neo-Marxism, or the reverse. Upon its publication, one Benjamin a letter of congratulations from Carl Schmitt. Okay, so this is like a theme, of course, throughout my intro to critical theory. Of course, this past, big first half of 2024. And so Derrida, when we look at this famous essay of his, Derrida is one of the people, the intellectuals who is putting on the map for us this tension between Benjamin and Carl Schmitt and the dialogue. And that goes on, it continues in current discourse on critical theory here. But if anything, one of the reasons why this essay by Derrida is important is because he's drawing our attention to that. He's not the only person drawing our attention to it. The Telos Journal, for example, throughout the late 80s, is already dealing with this kind of issue as well. And it creates this like a drop in readership for the journal because the journal was associated originally in 1968 with the New Left, or was the voice of a kind of giving voice to the New Left and to the classic critical theorists of people like Marcuse, for example. And so fast forward 20 years to the end of the 1980s, and the discussion has changed after all that happens in the 70s, after the rise of Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and Tina, the idea of Tina, or there is no alternative to capitalism. All of these things have changed culturally, and yet what they're doing is the critical theorists are doing is they're looking back at these discussions of earlier thinkers in the 20th century. So they're analyzing them, trying to make sense of liberal crises during their time. And I think that this is basically a really fundamental aspect of what critical theory does, is that like we're not just doing history, we've got to do that on the one hand. We're not just doing philosophy, right? And we've already had lots of readings throughout the first lectures in this particular course, where the philosophers like Horkheimer and Marcuse and Adorno are all pushing against. We're not just doing philosophy. They're, especially the way philosophy was being done up to the 1920s, it doesn't give us enough of an account. It doesn't give us that sociological account, right, that they want to give. Now, they're all going to have different opinions on the place of philosophy. So Adorno has famous essays that we haven't read on what is philosophy, right? Althusser is going to have different takes as well. So we're dealing on the one hand with history, on the one hand with philosophy, on the one hand with sociology, and with a kind of interventionist strategy. So we're trying to understand the moments of the past that are leading up to the ways that we are thinking about right now and trying to make some sort of an intervention. It doesn't have to be about prognosticating the future, but we do want to have a sense of what feels like it is inevitable and what might make the feelings of things that might seem inevitable might be a place for interruption, right? That's basically what I feel like critical theory is doing. And I'm not describing that in like a sort of political binary sense of left versus right, in the way that many people try to characterize the fundamental discourse. Yes, historically, many folks on aligning with the left are already doing that historical analysis. So the kind of historical materialism that arises out of Marxist thought definitely uh, works in harmony, I think, with critical theory. Its attempt to do ideology critique definitely plays a part in here as well. So not discounting the alignment with the left, but when I'm talking about are the historical alignment with left-leaning thinkers, but what if we're thinking about what critical theory is as a technique, as a method of thought, as a method of inquiry? I'm not describing that in political binary terms um, uh, here. So he's mentioned that Carl Schmitt admired this essay by Benjamin. Carl Schmitt, very right-wing, conservative Catholic jurist, and anti-Semite, appreciates Benjamin's essay on the critique of violence. So Carl Schmitt appreciates it. The great conservative Catholic jurist, still a constitutionalist at the time during the 1920s, but you are already familiar with his strange conversion to Hitlerism in 1933 and his correspondence with Benjamin, but also with Heidegger. As for analogies between the critique of violence and certain turns in Heideggerian thought, they are impossible to miss, especially those surrounding the motifs of Walton and Gewalt. The critique of violence concludes with divine violence at the end. Walter says of divine violence that we might call it devoltend. Um, Divine violence may be called sovereign violence, are the last words of the text. It is this historical network of equivocal contracts that interests me in its necessity and in its very dangers. In the Western democracies of 1989, with work and a certain number of precautions, lessons can still be drawn from it. So this is again his method. He is looking back to a discussion going on between the leftist, Walter Benjamin, and Carl Schmitt, and also Hitler. And he's saying that there's something going on that's of the time period and the crises in democracy that's happening in Germany of the period that is leading him to this discussion of violence, divine violence, or so-called sovereign violence. And we need to look back to that time period or have an eye toward that as we're thinking about mystical foundations of violence or everything else that he's talked about in the first half of the essay um, in 1989. Right. So going on here. Um, so that's the number one part of the essay. We're looking back to an earlier dialogue between these influential thinkers. but we have an eye towards 1989. The second reason here for using this text is keeping in mind the thematic of our colloquium. This text seemed exemplary to me up to a point, to the degree that it lends itself to an exercise in deconstructive reading. So my second, if I'm talking in Derrida's voice here, my second reason for having us look at this text is so that I can explain, I can give you an example of a text that is doing the work of deconstruction, right? And then third, this deconstruction is in some way the operation, or rather the very experience that this text, it seems to me, first does itself, by itself, on itself. What does this mean? Is it possible? What remains then of such an event, of its auto-heteroc deconstruction, of its just and unjust incompletion? What is the ruin of such an event or the open wound of such a signature? These are all kind of themes, questions that come up when we're doing a deconstructive reading of a text or we're watching a text deconstruct itself. Um, uh, what is the ruin of such an event or the open wound of such a signature? And that's a theme of the signature is going to be throughout Derrida's thinking as well. Remember to earlier contextualized readings where I talked about authorship, right? If you remember back to talking, me mentioning Roland Barthes and Michel Foucault on the death of the author and what is an author. So he goes on, and also in what does its strength consist? Strength precisely in the sense of Gewalt or violence, authority and legitimacy. That is one of my questions. It's a question about the possibility of deconstruction. If you will allow me to cite myself, I happened to write that, quote, the most rigorous deconstructions have never been claimed to be possible. And I would say that deconstruction loses nothing from admitting that it is impossible, and also that those who would rush to delight in the admission lose nothing from having to wait. For a deconstructive operation, possibility would rather be the danger of becoming an available set of rule-governed procedures, methods, accessible approaches. The interest of deconstruction of such a force of desire as it may have is a certain experience of the impossible. And this gets back to a problem with the way that deconstruction has often been conceived, especially in literature departments in the United States, as if it is just a kind of set of tools, right? Kind of in the way that I'm talking about critical theory in this course, right? Deconstruction is not something that is just a lens that you can apply to a text or a set of questions that you can bring to the text that isn't fixed in any sort of way, right? And so this definitely gets into what I feel like is happening in the world of critical theory in 20 in the 2020s, where I think that we do see current critical theorists going back and critiquing people like Derrida for remaining so abstract, right? For remaining in the only theoretical world. Whether or not that is an accurate description of Derrida altogether is not my purpose in this particular talk. But it's out there. I think the critiques are out there. I have pushed back on just saying that like someone like Derrida and deconstruction and the way that the current right wing wants to characterize him is just brings in relativism and no sort of truth, and that now we have like post-truth or post-fact culture, and it's all because of the postmodern philosophers like Jacques Derrida. I don't think that that is an accurate description of things, and so in some sense, I've put myself in a position of defending Derrida, whether or not he falls in line with Foucault and um, uh, Marcuse in the ways that Gabriel Rockhill has recently been critiquing those figures as kind of giving up on what the left ought to really be doing. I'll bracket that as well, but just to let you know that that's partly where critical theory is currently in discussing this kind of stuff. Whether no matter which way you fall in those sorts of debates, I don't think uh, that you do yourself any disservice by familiarizing yourselves with the history and the thinking of someone like Derrida. In other words, I still think he's worth engaging with. Um, uh, and I will mention something because something that Gabriel Rockhill said in a recent video or something. I follow him on the Critical Theory Workshop on Patreon, and I definitely am a fan. Was like I think he brings up a really good point that like these very famous theorists of the star theorists like Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault on the question of like should we just cancel these philosophers like or these thinkers? No, that's not exactly what the current critique is calling for. And Rockhill notes that like these people were getting the best amounts of funding that liberal Western society could offer, right? Like they were actually able to live and work um, uh, all of their life as intellectuals, which is something that's very, very hard to do, to have the resources to focus on our reading and on our research and on our thinking in general. So with all of the money and the resources and time that are put into that, we would expect that these thinkers would produce something worthwhile, right? It might not be what we want politically, depending on where our particular politics are for now and for 2024. So that's just like a way of thinking of it, and um, uh, whether I agree or disagree with Rockhill on all political questions, I definitely think he's a really good thinker. So uh, continuing on then with the essay here, Benjamin's demonstration continues the question of droit, law, or right, recht in Germany or German, right or law. It means to inaugurate, we shall be able to say, it even means to inaugurate, we shall be able to say it more rigorously in a moment, a philosophy of right or a philosophy of law. And so he goes on, he says, first, there's going to be a distinction. Then, so he's reading Benjamin's essay here, right? There's going to be a distinction between two kinds of violence in law in relation um, to law as right. The founding violence, the one that institutes and positions law, and or law making violence, and then the violence that conserves, the one that maintains, confirms, and ensures the permanence and enforceability of the law. So there's law establishing or law making violence, and then there's law preserving violence. He says, for the sake of convenience, let us continue to translate Gewalt as violence. But I've already mentioned the precautions that this calls for, right? So you can think about it as debt, if you remember from the earlier contextualized readings. As for translating recht as law rather than right, as in the published version I'm using here, that that is another problem that I'm going to set aside for right now. So then the other thing, so if we're reading Benjamin, we need to have these two competing notions of violence, founding violence and preserving violence. And then he says there's the distinction of the founding violence of law, termed mythic, implicit meaning Greek, it seems to me, and the annihilating violence of destructive violence, which is termed divine. Implicit meaning for him Jewish, it seems to me. So he's reading in Benjamin competing notions of so-called Greek thought and Jewish thought, and that in the Greek thought there is this kind of founding violence, and then in the divine violence, which he's associating with Jewish thought, there's going to be an annihilating or destructive kind of law. Finally, there is a distinction. Again, this is Derrida reading Benjamin. There's a distinction between justice as the principle of all divine positioning of the end, principle of all divine end making, and power as principle of mythic positioning of droit, of all mythical law making. In the title, The Critique of Violence, critique doesn't simply mean negative evaluation, like I'm going to talk about what's bad about violence, um, or legitimate rejection or condemnation of violence, but judgment, evaluation, examination that provides itself with the means to judge violence. The concept of critique, insofar as it implies decision in the form of judgment and question with regard to the right to judge, thus has an essential relation in itself to the sphere of law or right. Fundamentally, something like the Kantian tradition of the concept of critique, this concept of violence, permits an evaluative critique only in the sphere of law and justice, or the sphere of moral relations. There is no natural or physical violence. We can speak figuratively of violence with regard to an earthquake or even a physical ailment, but we know that these aren't the cases of a Gewalt violence able to give rise to judgment before some instrument of justice. So it's only from and within the concept of the paradigm of justice to begin with that we can develop the notion of critique. The notion of critique is not just negative critique or positive critique. It's not just thumbs up or thumbs down. It involves judgment and evaluation as possibilities themselves. And that's what's going to again take him back to Kant. Remember, Kant and his groundwork for the metaphysic of morals has been a big kind of shadow text to this long piece of Derrida's. He goes on, the concept of violence belongs to the symbolic order of law, politics, and morals, and it is only to this extent that it can give rise to a critique. Up to this point, this critique was always inscribed in the space of a distinction between means and end. But, objects Benjamin, to ask ourselves if violence can be a means with a view towards ends, just or unjust, is to prohibit ourselves from judging violence itself. The criteriology would then concern the application of violence, not violence itself. So how do we get at a critique of actual violence itself? We would not be able to tell if the latter as means is in itself just or not, moral or not. The critical question remains open then. The question of an evaluation and a justification of violence in itself, whether it be simple means and whatever its ends may be. The critical decision would have been foreclosed by the just naturalist tradition. For defenders of natural law, recourse to violent means poses no problems since natural ends are just. Recourse to violent means is as justified as normal as man's, quote, right to move his body to reach a given goal. Violence is, from this point of view, a natural product. Benjamin gives several examples of this naturalization of violence by natural law tradition. The state founded on natural law. He returns to Spinoza. I'd like to do a whole series on Spinoza's theological political treatise, but I won't say much about it right here. The ideological foundation of the terror under the French Revolution, and then the exploitations of certain Darwinism, and this could be applied to Nazism. The idea of eugenics or something like that, right? Cleansing populations, directing populations toward the most fruitful sort of biopolitical end, to use Foucault's idea. Scrolling down here to my highlight. Positive law would remain blind to the unconditionality of ends, natural right to the conditionality of means. Nevertheless, although he seems to dismiss both cases symmetrically from the tradition of positive law, Benjamin retains the sense of the historicity of law. Inversely, it is true that what he says further about divine justice is not always incompatible with the theological basis of all jus naturalisms. Um, in any case, the Benjaminian critique of uh, violence claims to exceed the two traditions and no longer to arise simply from a sphere of law and the internal interpretation of juridical institutions. It belongs to what he calls, in a rather singular sense, a philosophy of history, and is expressly limited to European particulars. Okay, so if we're going back to what Benjamin says, we can't just be talking about the application of violence within a particular justice system if we're trying to do a critique of violence itself. That said, violence has a kind of history to it. And I think that this is going to be that tension between Carl Schmitt and Walter Benjamin, and Benjamin working in the kind of leftist material historical Marxist traditions, but also adding in that mystical element that he's interested in, that he's going to call divine violence. And it's going to kind of position him as very quite different in his outcome than in Carl Schmitt, who wants to hold on to this mystical idea of sovereignty itself, that we must have this strong sense of sovereignty in order to have law to begin with. Um, and so uh, there is also, again, there is, because of that philosophy of history element, I think what Derrida is saying is that within Benjamin's thought and his reading, his philosophy of history is also going to give us a kind of messianic sense of futurity, but it's going to be particularly qualified in terms of a neo-messianic Judaism or Judaic mode of thought, right? So although this we would need many more lectures to get into this, we're thinking about like the ways that Greeks have been contrasted, or Greek thought has been contrasted with Jewish thought. Jewish thought traditionally, because of the way that the Talmud or the Pentateuch, first of five books of what the Christians call the Old Testament, um, establishes, even in the book of Genesis, establishes a kind of sense of time and temporality and historicity, and then a direct concern with particular lineages and generations, right? So from Jewish thought, we get a kind of divine actor. Yahweh is definitely acting in time and in the unfolding of history in terms of time. So that's why history is going to be particularly associated with the Jewish messianic notion here. At its most fundamental level, European law tends to prohibit individual violence and condemn it, not because it possesses a threat to this or that law, but because it threatens the juridical order itself. Once the law's interest, for it does have an interest in laying itself down and conserving itself, or in representing the interest that justly, justement, it represents. Law's interest may seem surprising, that is Benjamin's word, but at the same time, it is in its nature as interest. And in this sense, there is nothing surprising here at all to pretend to exclude any individual violence, threatening its order, and thus to monopolize violence in the sense, which is also to say authority. Law has a quote interest in the monopoly of violence. This monopoly doesn't strive to protect any given just and legal ends, but law itself. This seems like a tautological triviality, but isn't tautology the phenomenal structure of a certain violence in the law that lays itself down by decreeing to be violent, this time in the sense of an outlaw, anyone who does not recognize it? Performative tautology or a priori synthesis, which structures any foundation of the law upon which one performatively produces the conventions and guarantee and that guarantee the validity of the performative, thanks to one uh, thanks to which one gives oneself the meaning to decide between legal and illegal violence. This is almost like the theater in which violence might be critiqued itself, right? Here, it might be, it's necessarily dramatic in form. It's necessarily performative. Um, Echoes of Aristotle there for sure, right? In Greek tragedy. The expressions tautology and a priori synthesis, and especially the word performative, are not Benjaminian, but I'll adventure to suggest that they do not portray his purposes. So he's saying, as a reader, I understand I'm bringing this kind of language of performativity that Benjamin doesn't use himself. The admiring fascination exerted on the people by the figure of the great criminal can be explained as follows. It is not someone who has committed this or that crime for which one feels a secret admiration. It is someone who, in defying the law, um, lays bare the violence of the legal system, the juridical order itself. One could explain in the same way the fascination exerted in France by a lawyer like Jacques Verge, who defends the most difficult causes, the most indefensible in the eyes of the majority, by practicing what he calls the strategy of rupture, that is, the radical contestation of the given order of the law, of judicial authority, and ultimately the legitimate authority of the state that summons his clients to appear before the law. Judicial authority before which, in short, the accused appears without appearing and claims the right to contest the order or the law. Well, what order of law? The order of law in general, or the order of law instituted and enforced by the state, or order as inextricably mixed with the general state. So he's reached into some different theories of law, and also the practice of the contestation of law itself. The telling example here would be the right to strike. So this is back to Benjamin. And of course, the leftist Marxist tradition is definitely being invoked here, right? In class struggle, Benjamin notes that the right to strike is guaranteed to workers, who are therefore, besides the state, the only legal subject to find itself guaranteed a right to violence, and so to share in the monopoly of state in this respect. And that's super interesting to think about, like that way of thinking about like what groups have the right to violence in a state, and the state that the state through police or through military has the right to violence. Um, but also the workers have the right. And of course, in Marxian thought and Leninist thinking, especially if you remember back to us reading the state and philosophy, of course, that it works logically that there will be a kind of proletarian uprising that would create um, the temporary dictatorship of the proletariat, right? Because there is something I think that Derrida is getting at here, that shared in the monopoly on state violence that the workers would have within a state. Moving down to my next highlight here. Benjamin, uh, he says, but Benjamin clearly does not believe in the nonviolence of the strike. The striking workers set conditions for the resumption of work. They will not end their strike unless an order of things has changed. And so there is a violence against violence, right? And this is bringing up within Derrida's reading here the fact that that for Benjamin, Benjamin is not a strict pacifist. And that is a big discussion that's going on in the post-war years, right? If we think about thinkers like Aldous Huxley, who had become a huge pacifist and writes a book called Ends and Means in the 1930s, and then gets critiqued after World War II for holding on to pacifist notions um, uh, by German thinkers who um, uh, uh, see in that kind of pacifism a kind of, if not complicity, outright complicity with the violence of the National Socialist state or Nazism, at least a kind of quietism that allows the grossest forms of inhumanity to exist, right? So Benjamin is not a pacifist here. Um, and the workers' strike, although it might be working at sometimes at the level of symbology, or working as a violence against the violence of the state, is nevertheless a kind of violence. Over on the next page here at the top, the violence thus belongs in advance to the order of a droit or law that remains to be transformed or founded, even if it may wound our sense of justice. The violence of the strike wants to change the the way that things have been done in the past, but in doing so, it relies on our knowledge of the past to um, uh, be the conditions from which we might desire change to happen, right? So only this violence calls for and makes possible a critique of violence that determines it to be something other than the natural exercise of force. And so it is through the notion of something like the general strike that Benjamin is going to say that we can get to that critique of violence that isn't just the enactment of founding violence or conserving violence within a particular state, but it has to do with this kind of double rupture that you have the violence of the state on the people. That is the nature of the state to begin with. But you have within that the notion of the worker who has a shared relationship to the monopoly of violence in which it would resist the violence of the state in order to bring about a change in certain kinds of conditions. For a critique of violence, that is to say, an interpretive and meaningful evaluation of it to be possible, one must first recognize meaning in a violence that is not an accident arriving from outside the law. That which threatens law already belongs to it, to the law, the right to law, the law of the law, to the origin of the law. The general strike thus furnishes a valuable guiding thread since it exercises the conceded right to contest the order of existing law and to create a revolutionary situation in which the task will be to found a new law, if not always, as we shall see in the moment, a new state. Maybe it's not always a state revolution, but it's nevertheless the general strike is a way of bringing about violence to be a new foundation of violence. All revolutionary situations, all revolutionary discourses on the left or on the right, and from 1921 in Germany, there were many of those that resembled each other. This is Derrida saying, think about the time period when Benjamin is writing this. Um, uh, Benjamin often finding himself somewhere in between the right and the left of Weimar Germany. Um, so all revolutionary discourses on the left or on the right justify the recourse to violence by alleging the founding and progress or to come of a new law. And this law to come will in return legitimate retrospectively the violence that may offend the sense of justice, its future anterior already justifies it. The foundation of all states occurs in a situation that we can thus call revolutionary. It inaugurates a new law. It always does so in violence, always, which is to say, even when there haven't been those spectacular genocides, expulsions, or deportations that so often accompany the foundation of states, great or small, old or new, right near us or far away. And this is something just sort of to pop in, like some in my other work with Tinker and taking Native American critiques of 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 some of these thinkers. There's a famous essay from Russell Means from the early 1980s. It was a speech that he gave, and then it's been written down um, uh, where I think it's titled something like "In Order for America to Live, Europe Has to Die." And one of the things that Russell Means claims there is that Marxian thinking, this whole all of this thinking about what a revolution is really still part of the drama of Europe. And Derrida has said that for Benjamin here, Benjamin is taking Europe, the particularities of the European situation as his subject matter here. So Derrida wouldn't necessarily disagree. But if we were to take something like the Native American critique or like what Tinker and I sometimes say, is like we will characterize the Marxian critique within the broader social structure of Euro-Christian history, despite the fact that um, Marx himself is of Jewish descent, right? He's working within the hegemony of Euro-Christian social structure that presents this kind of linear temporality that presents the possibility of kinds of messianism or salvation narratives themselves. That's not the language that Derrida is using here, but I think it helps us maybe um, uh, uh, think of what like might give you a little bit more of a tangible sense of I think what Derrida's critique is going to be, because by the time we get to the end of Derrida's essay here, he's not going to be agreeing with Walter Benjamin, right? So that he's using Benjamin's text to explain deconstruction and the possibility of justice. And so Benjamin's text is going to kind of fall short, but because it's so dense in and of itself, I've just needed to kind of break in here, and it's not to spoil the end of the essay, but to give us a sense of where when we're going to see Derrida pull his um, thinking away from Benjamin's thinking here. So revolutions are the enactment of a shared monopoly on violence between the state and the workers, and they rely on the legal system and its history to begin with, even if it is going to be a refoundation of the founding violence instead of the conserving violence of the state. Goes on to say, in these situations, in the said to found law or the state, the grammatical category of the future anterior all too well resembles a modification of the present to describe the violence in progress. It consists precisely in feigning the presence or simple modalization of presence. Those who say, quote, our time while thinking our present in light of a future anterior, present do not know very well by definition what they are saying. It is precisely in this ignorance that the eventness of the event consists, what we naively call its presence. And just that language of event there showing up. And that's going to mean something again different in 1989 after the events of May of 68, for example, in France, which were one of these kinds of moments of uprising and the possibility. It didn't found a new republic at that particular moment, but I think that that's kind of what he's thinking about. And then the thinkers, a much more explosive discourse in the 21st century about philosophies of the event. So thinking about people like Alain Badiou and Zizek to us a certain degree there as well. Um, all of the interest in St. Paul, right? Badiou's book on St. Paul comes to mind there. Going on here, he says, this violence is certainly legible, indeed intelligible, since it is not alien to the law, no more than polemos or eris is alien to all the forms and significations of decay. But it is in droit and right or law what suspends law. It interrupts the established law to found another. This moment of suspense, this epoche or epoche, this sometimes that word is translated as reduction, but coalescence maybe here. This founding of revolutionary moment of law is in law an instance of non-law. Notice how he's dancing around what we might call the state of exception, right? And that Schmidt might call the state of exception, and we're going to get to Agamben's book after this, right? But that's kind of what Derrida's kind of arriving at, but he's using his own way into thinking about this. And I think that that's where the subtlety of his thought and his essay here is at work. This epoche, this founding or revolutionary moment of law is in law an instance of non-law, but it is also the whole history of law. This moment always takes place and never takes place in a presence. It is the moment in which the foundation of law remains suspended in the void or over the abyss, suspended by the pure performative act that would not have to answer to or before anyone. The supposed subject of this pure performative would no longer be before the law, or rather, he would be before a law not yet determined, before the law as before a law not yet existing, a law yet to come, encore, devant, et devant venir. Um, uh, yes, both before and to come, right? And this being, quote, before the law that Kafka talks about, and that's in a little excerpt called Before the Law, where we get like an allegorical structure of law. I'm not going to go into that too much here, but it's worth reading, and it's definitely short and interesting and in all sorts of regard, especially because he's getting at allegory. And of course, Benjamin is a master of thinking about allegory and symbolization. That's what his work on the Trauerspiel or German origins of German tragic drama is all about, that kind of um, uh, uh, shift from medieval slash early modern forms of allegory into modernity, the absent throne of the sovereign, the ubouwa, if we went to Alfred Jarry. So lots of different literary thinkers in Europe of the early 20th century thinking about this kind of stuff. Eventually, Endgame by Samuel Beckett, right? It's a good way of thinking about that. Um, so Kafka talks about this before the law resembles this situation, both ordinary and terrible, of the man who cannot manage to see or above all to touch to catch up to the law, because it is transcendent in the very measure that it is he who must found it as yet to come in violence. Here we touch without touching, this extraordinary paradox, the inaccessible transcendence of the law before which and prior to which, quote, man stands fast only appears infinitely transcendent and thus theological to the extent that so near him, it depends only on him, on the performative act by which he institutes it. The law is transcendent, violent, and nonviolent because it depends only on who is before it, and so prior to it, on who produces it, founds it, authorizes it in absolute performative, whose presence always escapes him. The law is transcendent and theological, and so always to come, always promised, because it is immanent, finite, and so already past. Every subject, in quotes here, is caught up in this aporetic structure and advance. This is such a great description, I think, of what again what Dr. Tinker and I mean when we're talking about Euro-Christian worldview and the way that it instantiates us in terms of time and subjectivity. It's a very Western Euro-Christian kind of discourse of time, temporality, and futurity, but it's built into the ways that we think about subjectivity. It's built into the ways that we think about um, individuality for sure. Only the yet to come, venue, will produce intelligibility or interpretability of this law beyond the letter of Benjamin's text, um, which I stopped following in the middle of commentary a moment ago, but which I'm interpreting from the point of its future to come, right? One can say that the order of intelligibility depends on its turn on the established order that it serves to interpret. It's like a really good description of what critical theory does. Um, this readability will then be as little neutral as it is nonviolent. A quote, successful revolution, the successful foundation of the state, in somewhat the same sense that one speaks of a felicitous performative speech act, will produce after the coup what was destined in advance, it was destined in advance to produce, namely proper interpretive models to read and return to give sense, necessity, and above all, legitimacy to the violence that it has produced. Among others, the interpretive model in question, that is, the discourse of its self-legitimation. Examples of this circle, this other hermeneutic circle, are not lacking near us or far from us, right here or elsewhere. Whether it's a question of what happens from one neighborhood to another, one street to another, one a great metropolis, or from one country or one camp to another around the world, a world war in the course of which states and nations are founded, destroyed, or redesigned. This must be taken into account in order to delimit an international law constructed on the Western concept of state sovereignty and non-intervention, but also in order to think its infinite perfectibility. Again, this is going back like echoes of Kant, right? Towards perpetual peace, for example. The idea that what we have is international law, we have sovereign states, the borders between those states are respected, and what Schmidt calls the friend-enemy relationship, for example. And it is through the stability of the recognition of sovereignty of states that we might have something like peace, right? There are cases in which it is not known for generations if the performative of the violent founding of a state is felicitous or not. Here we could cite more than one example. This unreadability of violence results in the very readability of all violence that belongs to what others would call the symbolic order of law, if you like, and not to pure physics. We might be tempted to reverse this, quote, logic like a glove, logic in quotation marks, for this unreadable is also very much, quote, illogical in the order of logos. And this is why I hesitate to call it symbolic and precipitately send it into the order of a Lacanian discourse. The logic of this readability, of this unreadability, in some it signifies a juridico-symbolic violence, a performative violence at the very heart of interpretive reading. And the example or index could be carried by metonymy back toward the conceptual generality of the essence. Um, yeah, a lot to be said there, and the way that he's gesturing towards Lacan. Um, he wants to say that there's something in this like violence of violence is within the founding violence that is not the same thing as what Lacan is getting at with, say, his idea of the real, right? Or the rupture of symbolic order itself. And he wants to say that it's a disruption of logos, the idea of logos itself, that holds in its paradox or in its aporia, um, uh, the symbolic and the non-symbolic, right? And so and this is going to, again, he comes back to the focus on the reader, right? On the readability, on the interpretability of things, right? And I think that partly that's where he's going to differ from Schmidt, because um, for Derrida, the emphasis on interpreter um, uh, is a different take than just saying that there's the sovereign who makes the decision in the state of exception. What Derrida is saying is that for any of this to exist, it kind of requires the instantiation of a subject or subjectivity that is able to comport itself towards a future to come, that is based on the inevitability of a certain kind of past. And the future is not completely made yet, but it is anticipated in a particular sort of way and sort of structure. And that moment of the not yet to come, but what will come or what will seem inevitable, is where Euro-Christian, Euro-Western subjectivity places itself, and it's an interpretive act instead of just the foundation of a particular kind of violence. He says, we might say then that there is a possibility of general strike, a right to general strike, and any interpretive reading, the right to contest established law in its strongest authority, the law of the state. That's what we do as critical theorists, right? It's not that we're just like anarchists who are out to like destroy all of the states or something like that. I think he's getting at something a lot more subtle, if less romantic, than the idea of the revolutionary, for example. As he would go down here. He says, faced with such a general strike, we can, in various cases, speak of anarchism, skepticism, nihilism, depoliticization, or on the contrary, of subversive over politicization. Today, the general strike does not need to demobilize or mobilize a spectacular number of people. It is enough to cut the electricity in a few privileged places. For example, the services, the public or the private, of postal service and telecommunications, of radio and television, or to introduce a few efficient viruses into well-chosen computer network, or by analogy to introduce the equivalent of AIDS into the organs and transmission into the hermeneutic Gespräch. It's an interesting take when we think about like the 21st century here, right? When we think about like the way that crises show up in terms of computer viruses or tech corporations that seem to be bigger than states themselves. Um, and all of the different modalities, and anarchism might be one particular modality that's part of this bigger complex that he's trying to get at. He says, can what we are doing here resemble a general strike or a revolution with regards to models, structures, but also modes of readability and political action? Is what deconstruction is? Is deconstruction a general strike, right? And there are going to be the people who think like, oh, if we're just doing this in terms of our reading as critical theorists, then we've given up on the action potential of the heart of leftism in its earlier Marxian sort of material historical sense. Um, are we just in the realm of theory here, or is Derrida getting at something else actionable in terms of the way that he's talking about performativity? He says yes and no. Yes, to the extent that it assumes the right to contest and not only theoretically constitutional protocols, the very charter that governs reading in all our culture and especially in the academy. No, at least to the extent that it is in the academy that it has been developed. And let's not forget, if we don't wish to sink into ridicule of indecency, that we are comfortably installed here on Fifth Avenue in New York, right? Only a few blocks away from the inferno of injustice, right? And besides, just as a strategy of rupture is never pure, since the lawyer or the accused has to negotiate it in some way before a tribunal or in the course of a hunger strike in the prison, so there is never a pure opposition between the general political strike looking to refound another state and the general proletarian strike looking to destroy the state. So there's a sense that Derrida is very aware that what we're doing in intellectual work, or at least the intellectual work of universities, is particular separated space, right? Um, and that there is something to be doing that is separate than the general proletarian strike. But he's not saying that we shouldn't be doing it, right? But he just said that we should be aware of our privileged conditions for sure. So he goes on to say, and so these Benjaminian oppositions seem to me to call more than ever for deconstruction. They deconstruct themselves, even as the paradigms for deconstruction. What I'm saying here is anything but conservative and anti-revolutionary. For beyond Benjamin's explicit purpose, I shall propose the interpretation according to which the very violence of the foundation of opposition of law must envelop the violence of conservation and not break with it. And this is where he's being provocative here, I think, and where, there are possibilities to push back on somebody who just wants to take a classic Marxian revolution of the proletariat, uprising, general strike sort of notion of things. He's saying that what we need is a theoretical component. We need the critical theory element of it. Yes, maybe it does end up happening in universities, but what we get from that is the challenging of all law itself, and the knowledge that when we are in a general strike or in a kind of revolutionary uprising, that we're relying on a particular sense of law and history, even when we are being revolutionaries or outlaws to a certain sense, in a certain sense, yes, like to the particular order of things. But if it's about anticipating a new kind of order, then we are implicated in the violence itself as well. And that we must take account of all of the aspects of law that Benjamin has described, not just the foundational violence, but the conservation of violence. If you were, to put it in very crass terms here, if you were to overthrow the state and create a new state, what are the new laws going to be? Like there has to be an anticipation of the law, the element of the law that will then preserve that new state or conserve that new state, right? So he looks over on the top of the next page here. Deconstruction is how we get at this, right? Deconstruction is also the idea adopted by necessity of a differential contamination. It is in thinking about this differential contamination as the contamination at which the very heart of law that I single out this sentence of Benjamin's, which I hope to come back to later. There is, he says, something rotten in law. There is something decayed or rotten in law, which condemns it or ruins it in advance. Law is condemned, ruined, and ruinous if we can risk the sentence of death on the subject of law, especially when it's a question of the death penalty. And it is in the passage on the death penalty that Benjamin speaks of what is rotten in law. He goes on to talk about how that Benjamin is not against the death penalty at all, but the death penalty is what gives us a sense of how law actually works, even though it is the most disgusting and the rotten aspect of law itself. And again, there will be Derrida will come back to the idea that Benjamin is far from being a pacifist here, right? So he goes on. If there's something of strike and the right to strike in every interpretation, there is also war and polemos. War is another example of this contradiction internal to law. There is a law of war. Schmidt will complain that there is no longer recognized that it is no longer recognized as the very possibility of politics. That's in the concept of the political, the Schmidt book. This law involves the same contradiction as the law of the strike. Apparently, subjects of this law declare war in order to sanction a violence whose object seems natural. Um, the other wants to lay hold of territory, goods, women. He wants my death. I kill him. But this warlike violence that resembles brigandage or outside the law or predatory violence or preemptive strikes we might think of in the 21st century is always deployed within a sphere of law. It's an anomaly within the legal system, which with which it seems to break. Here, the rupture of the relation is the relation. The transgression is before the law. In so-called primitive societies, where these meanings would be more clearly brought out, and the peace settlement shows very well that the war was not a natural phenomenon. No peace is settled without the symbolic phenomenon of the ceremonial. It recalls the fact that there was already ceremony in war. War then did not simply amount to a clash of two interests or of two purely physical forces. Here, an important parenthesis emphasizes that, to be sure, in the pair war/peace, the peace or the ceremonial recalls the fact that the war was also an unnatural phenomenon. But Benjamin apparently wants to withhold a certain meaning of the word peace from this correlation, in particular, the Kantian concept of perpetual peace. Here it's a question of a whole other, unmetaphorical and political signification, and the importance of which we may weigh in a moment. At stake is international law, where the risks of diversion or perversion for the benefit of individual interests, whether those of a state or not, require infinite vigilance, all the more so as these risks are inscribed in its very constitution. So law requires ceremony. After the ceremony of law, or sorry, the ceremony of war, the ceremony of peace signifies that victory establishes a new law. And war, which passes for originary and archetypal violence in pursuit of natural ends, is in fact a violence that serves to found law or right. From the moment that this positive, positional, and founding character of another law is recognized, modern law refuses the individual subject all right to violence. The people's shudder of admiration before the great criminal is addressed to the individual who takes upon himself, as in primitive times, the stigma of the lawmaker or the prophet. But the distinction between the two types of violence, founding and conserving, will be very difficult to trace to found or conserve. We are going to witness an ambiguous and laborious movement on Benjamin's part to preserve at any cost a distinction or a correlation without which his whole project could collapse. For if violence is at the origin of law, we must take the critique of this double violence, law-making and law-preserving violence, to its logical conclusion. I think that that feels like a good place to stop. So I will just stop this and I will pick up again with another contextualized reading when I get a chance. So thanks for your attention and your thinking alongside with me here and Derrida here. Have a good morning, afternoon, or evening, whenever, wherever you are.